Hello, my name is Jake Tisher, and today we're going to be talking about getting set up properly for ice fishing crappies. Now, getting set up properly for crappies underneath the ice is extremely important. It can make a big difference as to how many fish you have in your bucket at the end of the day. This is due to the fact that crappies can be in a very negative mood and can bite extremely light at times underneath the ice. Now, I'm not going to show any specific products on my video today in order to avoid copyright laws or other laws that I really don't want to deal with. So I'm just going to talk about the proper setup. So I'll start out with the line. Now what you want to use is either a 2-pound monofilament ice line or a 2-pound fluorocarbon ice line. You don't really want to use braid or braid with a fluorocarbon or monofilament leader for a couple of reasons. Reason number one being crappies underneath the ice will often come up and just touch a bait or barely bite it or mouth it, and as soon as they do that, they're going to feel you if you're using braid because of the no stretch, and then they're going to spit it out and decide not to bite, and you're not going to catch that fish. Whereas with monofilament or fluorocarbon, you would have caught that fish. Reason number two for not using braid is that fish in cold water, particularly crappies underneath the ice, when they're in a very negative mood, will come up and stare at a lure for a long period of time. And if you have braid directly tied to your lure, that crappie, while he's staring at your lure, will likely see your line or your knot. A braid knot on a lure is very large, very obtrusive, and a big turn off to fish when they will come up and stare at a lure for a long period of time. Now, you don't want to use a monofilament or fluorocarbon line that's larger than 2-pound test either. This is for a couple of reasons. Like we talked about with the braid, crappies in cold water will come up and stare at a lure for a long period of time. They will, with a larger diameter line, they're more likely to see either your line or your knot and become turned off and decide not to bite. Also, if you're fishing with a larger diameter fluorocarbon or monofilament line, particularly with a small jig in deep water, that line will coil and your jig will not have enough weight to pull the coils out, and when a crappie bites, you won't even be able to tell because he will just be pulling the coils and you won't even feel it on your spring bobber. Now, I'm not saying that you can't catch crappies underneath the ice with a braid or a larger diameter fluorocarbon or monofilament. All I'm saying is that you're going to get a higher percentage of your prospective biters. Those fish that come up to your lure that are in a much more negative mood, you're much more likely to actually catch them with a 2-pound fluorocarbon or a 2-pound mono than a braid or a larger diameter mono or fluorocarbon. Okay, now let's talk about the rod you want to use. Now, you want to have enough power to hook a crappie in deep water, but you also want to have enough give in your rod in order to fight a big crappie with your 2-pound test line. So what you're going to be looking at, depending on the brand, is going to be anywhere from a medium to a light action rod. But as long as it has enough power to hook a crappie in deep water and fight a big crappie on 2-pound test line. Also, you want to look for a rod that has fewer guides and larger guides. What this is going to do is it's going to reduce freeze up because you're going to have less freeze points and larger guides, which are less likely to freeze up. What that's going to help you with is that's going to make it so you can fish outside of your house more and thus cover more water and find more fish. Now we come to what might be the most important part, is your spring bobber. Now what you want is a very sensitive spring bobber with one large hole, not one that looks like a spring or with a smaller hole. What this is going to do is this is going to reduce freeze up again and make fishing a lot easier, make you much more efficient, make it much easier to fish outside of your house and find more fish. So why a spring bobber and not a traditional bobber or just buy a rod with a very sensitive tip? The problem with a traditional bobber is since crappies are in a very negative mood often underneath the ice, they'll come up and touch a lure or bite a lure very slightly, and when they feel that bobber, the weight of that bobber, they'll let it go and decide not to bite. That'll turn them off. Now again, you'll catch some crappies on a traditional bobber, but you're not going to catch as high of a percentage as you will with a spring bobber. You're going to catch the more active ones, but you won't catch the ones that are less active because they're going to feel that weight of that bobber and decide not to bite. Also, the problem with just getting a rod with a very sensitive tip is that oftentimes they're just not sensitive enough. The bite will just be so light that you won't be able to even tell, and by the time you do tell, the fish is going to feel you and decide that he's going to spit it out and he's not going to bite. Now, there are rods that basically have a spring bobber built into the end of them. The problem with those rods is that there's many small guides on them, and that's a lot of freeze points. If you're going to fish in your house all the time, then that'd be fine because you're not going to be freezing up all the time. But if you want to fish outside at all, then you just want to go with a spring bobber and not one of these rods that has the many small guides and the spring bobber built in. Now let's talk about your lure choice. Generally what you want to start out with, and generally what's going to work 80% of the time better than anything else, is going to be a number 8 ice jig with one wax worm stripped on. Now, maggots will work as well, but waxworms will work generally a lot better when fish are in a negative mood. I believe it's because they're softer, they're squishier. Maggots are a little bit harder. So you can use maggots, they will work, but waxworms will always work where maggots will work sometimes, but not always. Where maggots are very useful is when you get a good bite going, the fish aren't in a very negative mood, and you're either trying to sort out through small fish, or you don't want to sit and rebait all the time, because maggots will stay on your hook a lot better. But waxworms, you will get a lot more bites when fish are in a negative mood. Now say you're fishing with your number 8 hook and your single waxworm, and you're catching nothing but smaller crappies. That means you may have to beef up your bait a little bit because the fish are in a more aggressive mood, and the larger crappies are not interested in your presentation because it's too small. In that case, you'd want to go with a crappie minnow or even a regular size fathead. Conversely, if you're in a situation where you're using your number 8 hook and your single waxworm and you're just not catching any fish, you have a lot of fish coming up on your locator and they're just not biting, you may need to downsize in that situation. Go down to a number 12 or a number 14 hook and still fish with your single waxworm, same setup, same rod, same line, same spring bobber, and often what will happen is you'll start catching fish at that point. Because what you've done is you've matched your presentation to the mood of the fish. It may be necessary to downsize like this in situations such as very high fishing pressure, you're fishing during midday where there's a lot of light penetration, or you're fishing on a very cold day, or maybe you're fishing in a permanent fish house that's been in the same spot for 2 or 3 weeks where that particular set of holes sees a lot of fishing pressure. So next time you're out on the ice chasing crappies, give this setup a try. It'll work for you. Good luck.